Let us now look at, in some detail, both around the scale of the issues that we're trying to address, and then importantly, in some detail, what proposal we're putting forward and how they can actually be implemented. So let me just share a few slides with you to give you some indication of the scale of the data being collected that we think needs to be addressed. So here we can see a slide from the excellent researchers at Columbia University in Mapping the Data project, where they have gone and looked just at the terms of use and the privacy policies of the big four platforms, and US platforms that is, and just looked at what sort of data they're collecting, for what sort of purpose, and from what sources in those terms and conditions. And it's more than 450 different items of information around the individual. But it's not just, the big platforms collect information. We also know that sitting behind them and sitting in the system is many other companies who are collecting personal information around individuals. This is a good chart done by David Meem, an expert in the SEO space, and this was just on the local search ecosystem for Google plus local, and all the different companies and sources of information that were being collected and then repurposed and brought into Google. So there is complete ecosystems of data aggregators and collectors operating in these markets that many consumers don't understand. Also, we know that many app builders on the various mobile phones in particular are surreptitiously capturing personal data. And there were some researchers who've done some excellent work last year showing that there were over 1,300 apps on Android who didn't have location permission, and yet we're still finding ways of getting around that lack of location permission to transmit location data. They were collecting it in other different ways. And some of these applications had hundreds of millions and even billions of installs. So this was widespread. Secondly, other researchers have shown that some of the smartphone apps, while they may not turn on your phone, are certainly taking screenshots or screen recordings to send back both to themselves and to third-party analysts. And so we can see here that the whole process of trying to find data by apps is widespread and in some respect quite surreptitious. But it's not just the sort of existing ecosystems of mobile phones, of internet search. The Internet of Things is really starting upon us. We've now got something like 7 billion devices connected to the Internet of Things. By 2025, that could be up to nearly 22 billion. And some of the researchers are beginning to show that, either by design or inadvertently, a lot of the IoT devices are collecting information that, again, we should be taking into consideration. Researchers at APNIC have shown for sort of IoT devices designed to be around the home, more than 50% of them are sending information to destinations, or 50% of the destinations they're sending information to is not the first party, not the person you bought it from, not the person you got the contract with, but for some other third party. And then nearly 90% of these devices are sending out data where at least one of the activity being measured could be used to identify unexpected activities. In other words, they can be inferring information about the consumer that the consumer does not realize the device is doing. So we've got a broad range of data collection in this world, which is expanding enormously and which we feel needs to be really sort of addressed. And that's the reason we put forward, as we've already indicated, a breakdown and way of thinking about personal data. First of all, that there are 3 types of data: O data, or sort of official type data, C data, and privy data. Now let's just go to that in some detail, because the questions I'd like to talk about are, how do we implement the proposal for individuals to be able to control their O data and first-party privy data? How do we ensure that second-party privy data is used in the data subject's best interests? How do we protect vulnerable users? And thirdly, how do we establish the legal and governance incentives to promote community-based and accountable use of specific parts of personal data for the common good, establishing the digital data commons? So what do we mean by O data? And this is just some examples, names, personally identified numbers like social security, passport numbers, driver numbers, street addresses and email addresses, telephone numbers, photographic images, finger writing, fingerprints, retina scans, biometric data, information identifying personally owned property. And I think also importantly, the asset information, particularly media access control addresses for computers and phones, or IP addresses that are consistently linked to a potential individual person. These things, I think, are important examples of the data which really identify the person and which are key for the setting up of accounts with many organizations when you're setting up a customer relationship. So when we're saying what sort of system should individuals be able to use to control their OData, and for that matter, their first-party privy data, there's several steps that we would see in terms of this. First and foremost is the authentication and the hosting of collated data. So the indication here is that you might use a service provider or a private player or a government actor that actually would help the individual, the user, to enter their key official data records. And that these data records would be authenticated from either government sources or other noted third-party authentication methods, potentially if it's a university qualification from a university, if it's a other forms of data that they've got noted third-party recognised authentication mechanisms, those ones being used, and that these authentication bodies would actually digitally sign these data records, so that the signatures ensure a digital paper trail as to the authenticity of the record. At the same time, it's important that these records actually be controlled by the individual. So that it's individual sovereignty, individual control over records which are authenticated by third parties. And in situations where potentially there might be concern about political bias, what have you, we suggest perhaps the European Commission could play a role in Europe of being the authenticator of the authenticators, if you like. Having an institution that could sign, for instance, government certificates at the national level or subnational level, as implicitly, and to ensure that all records are being treated openly and fairly. The function of these records really is to ensure that we've got authentic data and that's under the control of the individual. And it follows the models we've been following in anti-money laundering and know your client. This stuff's been done in the financial services sector now, and for quite some time. The second part of the system we're proposing, and an important one, is to ensure that the legal obligation for all companies and entities who are looking to source that sort of official type data should only come from the citizen-controlled record. At the moment, there are literally hundreds and thousands of ways in which people can scrape and put together data about the individual without the individual knowing and without necessarily being accurate. And the difficulty with that is if there are hundreds of avatars of poor Twomey out there in the ether, then there is no way I have any control over what's done with that data. I have no control over access to it, and I've got no control over the accuracy of it, and I've got no control whether I wish that company or that player that's using that data to do so. This is where the legal obligation to ensure that if companies wish to draw that data, they have to draw it from the citizen-controlled record is very important. And it does draw from two things we already have in the European markets. One is, as an analogy, the use of the European identity card. If one goes to a hotel, for instance, and registers in a hotel, you have to actually use your European identity card for the purpose of registration. It's not that the hotel can't get the data from somewhere else. It is that the law requires the use of the identity card, and hence the focus on the particular point. The second point is the GDPR has already required companies to do the hard work on this topic. They've already been required to identify where they hold records, personally identifying records on individuals and consumers inside their systems. So this is not asking them to do any more work in terms of identifying inside where they're holding records. The next step is to say, okay, that the data in that record is reconciled against the data that's held in the citizen control record, and there is a digital signature fingerprinting process between the two to give the company confidence that it has the accurate data. The third related point then is that authorization for access is according to negotiated terms. And here we think the important issue is that individuals should have the same rights online as they have offline. Online, we have rights of association. We have the ability to come in groups and negotiate, particularly, the obvious example is the ability to negotiate employment terms and salary terms. And you can see this in labor economic terms as well. we are saying here that there is a need for not just for the individual to have control and access, but for them to have some voice back in the power structures around the way in which the data is used in the information society. Their data is used in the information society. And to have that sort of negotiation, they need to have expertise, people who can understand the 450 different items that are being collected used by the platforms and other such things, and who can potentially put together negotiation positions on behalf of the individual, which allows the individual to control and say when they're willing to share it and when they're not, and also potentially gives them greater economic say and benefit in terms of the data being collected. And hence, the ability to negotiate terms requires two things. One is a collective bargaining mechanism, or a mechanism for association to bring big numbers to bear. And secondly, that companies can only access the data according to those negotiated terms. And so not only when a company is sort of going to do the official type data from the record, but that the service provider then would also be able, or a second party working with the service provider would be able to help negotiate the terms under which privy data, first party privy data, for instance, could be accessed, or other forms of personal data. The third items that will be available here is that companies will be able to implement the initial official data request, and we think reasonably easily because of the work done in GDPR. But they'll also have a mechanism drawn perhaps from the models used in the domain name system, etc., of being able to update data easily and regularly. So it gives a benefit to companies that they know the data about the individuals they've got is updated regularly and is accurate. The other great benefit we think the companies will get from this form of system is that the data will be authenticated. And as a consequence, we expect it to significantly decrease the risk of fraud by vendors, customers, potentially by employees. And secondly, because of the flow of authentication records and fingerprint records, certificates that flow with that data, we think that the record just sitting by itself is not very valuable. It has to be in the particular company's position holding. If a company holds that data, it would have certificates showing the source of data and the fingerprint showing that related to the particular transaction they authenticated that data with. As a consequence, it's of less value to a cyber criminal to steal that data and then try to sell it to a third party, because it doesn't come with the associated certificates needed for the third party. And we finish with the auditing of companies, because we think the auditing of companies to ensure the use of official data is consistent with the regime set above. It can be done as part of the auditing regime for companies undertaken presently, for normal accounting purposes. The accountants have a lot of IT skills and potentially may need some retraining, but they have the IT skills to do this. Again, the auditing process ensures that the data is actually the data sourced from the official type of record, and it makes the market for secondary data to be sold backwards and forwards about individuals diminish, because if you're holding that sort of data and you get audited with it, then it's a little bit like being in a regime where you're in receipt of stolen property. So we think it does actually have some real benefits for both diminishment of fraud and improving the cybersecurity environment. We also think that the data can be held according to existing security standards. There are existing user standards centers for storing data. SOC 2 and the GDPR itself have compliance for this, setting forward strict information security policies, procedures, encompassing the security, availability, processing, integrity, and confidentiality of user data. There's also guidance instructions as to how to manage user data. NIST has those data, as does the GDPR. And there's a very interesting example at the moment of the payment card industry compliance model, which also gives you guidance on user data. And what we've seen in that industry is that gradually over time, when there have been breaches of credit cards held by, say, retailers, that the market's evolved such that there are now specialized companies that just look after the holding of the credit card information. And most retailers now do not hold that data themselves. And those specialized companies, high degrees of security, high degrees of specialization are holding that data securely. So we expect that sort of model may well be applicable in this environment, that you will end up with very specialized companies that could actually are dedicated around the security of holding this data. And these companies also, in all these existing security standards, there's a requirement for third-party policy and technology audits. And we would recommend in this environment that we're putting forward that such audits should also be included in communications to users, so that users have good understandings of the security around the people who are holding their authenticated data. Let's then look at the second types of data, and particularly privy data which is not put up by the individual. We've called second-party privy data, data that is actually either inputted or collected or inferred by a second party about an individual. And in that space, we're saying we think it's very important that beyond whatever conditions might be negotiated for use of the data with a user, that there also be a general rule that the data should be held in the interest of and used in the interest of the data subject. And here again, we're saying we should apply the same rules that apply offline to the rules that apply online. And where we've had over literally hundreds of years in the West, a development of sets of rules where people who have intimate data and asymmetric data holdings with individuals, religious leaders with their followers, doctors with patients, teachers with students, lawyers with their clients, government agencies with citizens, etc., that we have quite specifically got rules that say that the person who holds the data must hold it and use it in the interests of the data subject. But at the moment, as we saw earlier, there are hundreds, there are thousands of companies who are collecting enormous amounts of data about individuals, about me, whom I have no idea who they are, and they have no obligation, no fiduciary obligation to use that in my best interest. And a Cambridge Analytica could say it held 5,000 items of data about each individual in the United States. And yet there is no way of saying that data has to be held and used in the interest of those individuals. So we would say that the government should simply legislate to apply the same rule that applies offline to what applies online. But then we should make certain that we've got some sort of objective test of what the interest of the data subject is. And that test should be, we would argue, grounded in the European Convention on Human Rights and on European law governing relationships between professionals and their data subjects. We have to have a legal basis for saying what is the interest of the data subject, not subjective interpretation by a company which says, my providing you the most attuned and finely attuned advertising is in your best interest. That certainly, we think would fail what we'd see as the test. And it's very important, I think, that the same principle should apply to IoT digital service providers as it does the other forms of data. Thirdly, let's now look at the issue of common data and of the data that could be collected, which is not at the moment because of the emphasis and the resources all going into the free provision for advertising business model. And here's where we think the opportunity for the establishment of data commons can be very important. Just as the data commons or commons applies to fields, the use of bogs in parts of the world for fuel, fishing grounds, other sort of areas, it could similarly apply to the use of data that we could put forward as a common use. And we would argue that the European Union member states and the Commission should really draw on existing models of organisation, including clubs, cooperatives, trade unions, trade associations, to provide an EU-wide legal definition of the data commons. In the United Kingdom, the phrase is used, the data trust. But we know that trust law doesn't apply out in some parts of the European Union. And so this whole area of law does need some, we think is reasonably simple, but does need some collation and unification around what it would be a data commons. And then the data commons rules should be set forward to ensure that data commons identity and its data sharing policies are carried out in the interests of its subjects with appropriate privacy and security standards. And that fiduciary responsibilities be clear for the commons management to data subjects to carry out their collective will and not cause harm. And we think one of the ways to ensure that data commons remain true to their cause is ensure data interoperability. If you're unhappy with the way in which a particular data commons is measuring something and you still want the benefit but somebody else is offering it, take your data elsewhere. If you don't like what they're doing, take your data yourself and just take it out. Now, this is something you can't do in the big platforms. You can't do in the data aggregators. You can't take your data away. We argue data interoperability is essential, particularly in the data commons. Where could the data commons become really important? The obvious example this year is in medical research and in responding to medical crises. We could agree to put our medical data into a commons held very securely, held anonymously, where the data could be tracked longitudinally with particular records and give real insight into dealing with particular diseases. We could agree to share our data around, say, electricity consumption and sources and electricity patterns to give us much greater detail around what the things that are driving, for instance, behavioural patterns that may be driving aspects of climate change. We could agree that we wanted to share data amongst, let's say, members of a trade union or a group of trade unions share their data or detailed data around pay statistics and employment records to give more detail about what are the variances going on in a particular industry. There is many ways in which people may decide they want to share data. But there needs to be a mechanism for the data commons to be created and held accountable. And that's what we argue for here. So this is just some quick summation of the points we're putting forward for moving forward with a new form of data governance inside the European Union. We think it can make quite a difference in underpinning many of the initiatives of the European Union around data governance, and think that the European Union in particular is the essential power, the essential digital power in the modern world to drive a greater sense of autonomy and citizenship power and civil rights in the fast-moving information age. Thank you.